Chapter 21, Walking Fermentations. The picture you see is the grape must. This is the grape juice, right after the grapes have been crushed. So we cold soak them like that. They stay like that, usually a few days, extracting all of that wonderful grapey color. Then once we start the fermentation, they begin to rise. So you'll notice you don't see the juice. So what's going on is all the juice is underneath there, and it's slowly but surely becoming wine. So alcohol is increasing, sugars are decreasing. And one of the things that we do as winemakers is we punch down the cap, usually with a punch down tool. This is a traditional punch down tool. It's a stainless one. Paul, the winemaker, actually has a special one that he sometimes uses, an old Virginia Tech paddle. All right, well, this gives you some idea of the winemaking process. Let's go into this story. So again, it's Walking Fermentations, chapter 21. Lifting the veil of nets, revealing grapes' luscious lips, is equivalent to "you may kiss the bride." And after the wedding celebration, after the guests have left, the newlyweds retreat behind closed doors. Yeast is the aphrodisiac he offers, and she willingly accepts, a catalyst to bubbling desire. Fermentation starts, foreplay begins, the marriage is consummated. Although the chemical reaction of every fermentation is the same, yeast convert sugar into ethyl alcohol. Each fermentation is unique. Some batches ferment quickly, perhaps in 4 days. Others take 2 weeks. The winemaker's aim is to control it before new red wine is separated from grape skins and seeds by the press. She might slow it down with air conditioning or dry ice to make sure it doesn't go too fast. The same with aging and our bodies. We're all decaying, walking fermentations. Sheila noticed Paul's fermenting during harvest month after he sipped bubbling batches of grape juice. The lingering scent of his bowel movements resembled fermentation byproducts in the vats. Over at Cougar Winery, Carrie Ann and Lum endeavored to improve the floral characteristics of her wine by experimenting with new yeast strains. Tasting from the vat of fermenting wines threw gas on the fire of Carrie Ann's constitution. Energized by flatulence propulsion, her signature exhaust followed her like an invisible contrail wherever she walked during harvest season. Perhaps this was a reason she hadn't married. She needed a partner who could stomach fermented farts. It's a sultry end of August evening, and the vintner returns home from work, slips into something more comfortable, walks into the conjugal chamber, and removes his shirt, not wanting to stain it. As a magician yanks a cloth off a dining room table without moving a plate or spilling a drop of wine, he yanks the bedsheet covering the bride to reveal her full frontal womanhood. The time has come. Fermentation is underway. Pressure is building. He gently grasps grape skins into his hand, admires their aroma, kisses and nibbles them. He gently caresses the top of her grape mound, finding the warmest spot, and gently probes with his finger. He uses his hand to guide his tool, pressing against the membrane, pushes and pushes again with a bit more force. His staff breaks through the layer of skins into hot lava and penetrates deeper and hits her back wall, and when he pulls out, the next thrust slides, glides, and he holds it deep, then retracts slowly and starts steady waves of pushes and thrusts. The vintner finds his rhythm, punching, thrusting, pushing, and he hears ocean waves and the crash of splashing nectar in a fountain of bubbling, foaming juices, and he gently slides his finger into the tunnel that widens into a cavern where he feels the yeasty warmth of her frothy fermentation, and pulls out his finger and licks the sweetest of juices and is pleased. Fruit of the vine, ambrosia of the gods. Tasting this sweet syrup will change your life forever. A gift from God to the people of God. Amen. And he's back, thrusting rhythmically, for he must continue a few more minutes, working the sides of the trough, making sure to touch every spot, muscles tightening, Drips of sweat appear on his brow, biceps bulge. The dog is barking, triceps ripple, and he plunges his tool as deep as he can into the middle of the vat, slips and falls into a purple bath of grape juice. All his adult life he has attempted to re-enter the womb, and now has succeeded. As he climbs from his bath, his dog licks his face. All he can do is laugh at his silly self and beg the dog not to jump in. After laying down to sleep, he enters a higher level of consciousness winemakers for generations, since the beginning of time, have known. Nothing is more erotic than punching down a cap of fermenting grapes. During dawn's darkness, he punches down again. Morning delight, filming himself shirtless, mano a vino, forwarding the footage to three muses, arousing each as she watches her suitor thrust his staff into the vat with the finesse of the sensuous man loving a batch of wine. Their undergarments leak. Afterwards, Paul hangs the blood-stained sheet covering the conjugal vat outside to dry, proof the marriage is consummated. Every morning and evening for 7 days, he makes love in this way with his wine without falling into the vat. He vows next time he finds himself in a hot tub of fermenting grape juice, he'll be kissing, caressing, licking the love of his life, and not licked by a dog. Nothing is more erotic than punching down a cap of fermenting grape skins, except, perhaps, watching a woman do it, and Paul was inspired to walk to Carrie Ann's to see if he could assist her with her punch-downs, and texted he was on the way. She looked tired as a balloon leaking air. He was concerned and inquired about her health. "I've got a yeast infection," she smiled. "How was your trip to Milwaukee? Did you catch the cougar?" he asked to change the subject. She traveled there when the media reported a wild cougar on the prowl downtown. "Catch a tiger by the toe." "I should have known. How was it?" "A real hoot. Handed out bottles of wine to all the volunteers." "And how many volunteers did the cougar catch?" "You're naughty." "I'm not the naughty one. How much wine did you sell?" "Signed up over 100 people for the Cougar Club." "You're amazing." "Thank you. I know." By the fourth evening of this ritual honeymoon of punch-downs, Paul became slightly fatigued, and by the end of the week, his labor of physical love for the grape had become work, even routine, like a marriage. Yet, the start of each winemaking season is as exciting as sharing secrets of the Kama Sutra with a partner for the first time, breathing each other's life force, embraced and intertwined, as tightly wound together as a grapevine clinging to a pole. Of course, there was bottling, when you plunge the cork into the bottle, about as lewd as winemaking gets. And then there was pressing, an art form unto itself, and another chance to be the sensual man, the sensual woman, the sensual winemaker. Garagistes pressed by hand until their operations grew large enough they upgraded to an electricity-powered bladder press. For Bluey and Paul, pressing was done by hand and paw. The dog supervised, as he did most everything in the winery. The first time they pressed, it was Labor Day weekend and a holiday for most, but Paul and Bluey never worked harder. Paul didn't have a basket press, but Blum's winemaking manual described a technique for pressing a small batch of grapes by hand. Warning to wannabe winemakers: a half-ton of grapes is not a small batch, and man does not crush with hands alone. For what could have been finished in 2 hours with a basket press took Paul the better part of 12 without. Fortunately, the man who couldn't tie a slipknot had a talent for finishing a task he started, whether shoveling 30 yards of compost from a dump truck, clearing a patch of land from the clutches of ivy, or bottling a barrel. He deserved that Virginia Tech paddle for perseverance, his punch-down tool, his first years making wine. Paul discovered, by dipping a bucket into fermented grape must, he could capture free-run wine by slowly pushing the bucket's open mouth against the side of the fermenter, and juice streamed in. He collected a gallon into a bucket, pouring the new wine into a clean container for settling. This technique came in handy years later when he started making blush wine extracting buckets of pink bliss without skins from the vat after the grapes were broken. Dipping the bucket only went so far, because when you reach the container's bottom, you're pushing the bucket against grape skins without capturing wine. So the unhandy Paul jerry-rigged a press. He bought wire, the kind his father used to build a rabbit hutch where their pet rabbit walked outside his covered home onto a wire porch to drop pellets. The mesh was wider than a screen door, which wouldn't allow liquid to flow through. He placed the wire at the bottom of the perforated hand-carry shopping basket he borrowed from Vaughn's grocery. He duly returned when finished, his days of juvenile delinquency gone, mostly. He called the bucket his favorite bucket and filled it with moist grape skins and soup and emptied it into the shopping basket. The wire held back the skins as new wine dripped through the holes. He placed the shopping basket over a container and used the bottom of his favorite bucket to press against the skins in the basket, and more wine trickled out, reminding him of Kate's and Alex's toilet training as toddlers. Bluey inspected the stream of wine, licked it 4 times, then went over to a corner and watched a few minutes until he crashed asleep. Paul leaned on his favorite bucket in the shopping basket with all his weight, doing push-ups and squat thrusts, and slowly, surely, blood was squeezed from the stone, and wine was extracted from grape skins. The process repeated itself dozens and dozens of times as morning turned into afternoon and afternoon into evening, as the ant ate the elephant one bite at a time. When Paul told Carrie-Anne how he pressed his wine, she immediately purchased a basket press and quickly scooped wine and skins into the basket she only needed to fill twice. The skins coagulated against the basket's wooden slats, and wine flowed freely into the catch bucket like a river over a fall. She realized how fast the wine flowed after it was all over her garage. She never made that mistake again, and timed it so she only needed 2 catch buckets, hardly spilling a drop, exchanging the empty bucket for the full one she dumped into a holding tank, repeating the maneuver 60 times. Now that Paul had his new wine into 2 brut containers and 2 5-gallon Arrowhead water bottles, he opened the lid and saw bubbling. He telephoned Carrie-Anne. "What do I do next?" "You have the wine in containers, right?" she asked. "Yes, with the lid on top. The bubbles you see are providing CO2 gas to protect the wine. Don't take the lids off again. You need that to get that wine. You need to get that wine into airtight containers, or it will oxidize." "How do I do that?" "Buy a barrel." "Where do I get one?" "Hell if I know." "What about the wine in the 5-gallon containers? Do you have an airlock?" "I put rubber plugs in." "The wine will explode." "What do I do?" "You need airlocks. I have 2 kinds. One with a bubble and the condom ones." There she goes again. "I'd rather you show me the condom ones than the guy in the winemaking supply store. Sounds like I need to go back over there and ask him about a barrel and airlocks." Paul purchased a used French barrel for $100. Lum advised sticking your nose in a used barrel to make sure it's okay, and Paul assigned Bluey the task. The dog stood by the hole, and Paul pulled out the bung and fanned fumes in the dog's direction, who smiled approval. Paul washed the barrel with barrel clean, water and ash soda that required him filling and rinsing the barrel several times. Bluey held the hose filling the barrel, and Paul emptied the water into the garden. It took so much time, Paul vowed never to buy a used barrel again. The next year, he purchased a new 15-gallon barrel and put in new Nebbiolo wine, the grapes grown by Camilla and Baja. Small barrels impart oak quickly, and in a few months, Paul had the oakiest wine Sheila had ever tasted. So Paul siphoned the oaked wine from the barrel into 3 5-gallon Arrowhead water bottles, to the consternation of the Arrowhead man, whose disapproval diminished each Christmas when he received his tip in wine. Bottling early left Paul an empty barrel 6 months before needing it again. He asked Carrie-Anne what to do, and she recommended sulfur sticks. Afterwards, he filled the barrel with water and potassium metabisulfite and put it outside. He checked it a month later and noticed the liquid had turned light brown, the barrel imparting oak flavors to the water. That seems like a waste, Paul thought. He checked again a couple of months later, and Bluey turned away. "Sheila, could you smell this, please?" Her nose was keen as a hawk's sight. Rotten eggs. Smells like Carrie-Anne in heat. I wonder what happened. Indeed, the barrel took on the noisome fumes of gas propulsion that powered Carrie-Anne. Paul decided he would never store an empty barrel again because it was too much work and risky for the wine in which they poured their souls. If nature abhorred a vacuum, Paul abhorred empty barrels and didn't want to bother with cleaning and storing them because he might ruin the wine. He coordinated bottling with racking. So right after bottling a barrel, he racked a batch of new wine in without rinsing. For Paul believed any residual wine would blend well with the incoming new, which was true unless the old was contaminated. Reusing a barrel saves money for the hobbyist, but after a few years it becomes neutral, contributing little to no flavors. Lum taught amateur winemakers how to add wood chips to wine in a neutral barrel. Paul's preferred method was to borrow a stocking from Carrie-Anne, fill it with oak chips, and lower it like a fishing line through an ice hole into the wine to steep. Merlot Mac found a supplier of liquid oak flavor he once added to his wine. Australia and New Zealand winemakers pioneered the use of flexible, breathable polyurethane tanks that were easy to clean and allowed micro-oxidization and slow aging of wine, with many commercial winemakers down under adding wood staves or wood blocks to impart oak flavors. Paul came to believe the odds of contamination increased each year a barrel was reused, especially when a promising young Tempranillo he racked into a 4-use barrel veered off within a few months. Another hard lesson. As Paul transitioned from amateur to a professional, whose mission was to make only great wines, he purchased a fleet of new barrels and took an oath to use each barrel only twice, except for port-style wines, some of which he put outside for years in direct sunlight to accelerate oxidization and aging. He used old barrels for more than candle holders. He made tables or gave them to craft breweries to make subtle sours from wine yeast. And eventually he discovered a shop that made household items from used wood and glass, a responsible way to repurpose barrels and bottles. A day spent bottling and racking new wine into a freshly empty barrel often finished at midnight and included several traditions. The most infuriating was spilling wine. It always happened. After bottling, Paul needed to pump new wine from airtight containers, usually flex tanks, and invariably the pump jammed or worse, in which case he frantically called Carrie-Anne for hers. These neighbors borrowed 100 grams of yeast, 2.5 grams of malolactic bacteria, a baggie of yeast food, corks, capsules, or carboys when they ran out. Whenever Carrie-Anne's pump broke, she called John, who disassembled it, inserted a new membrane, and got it going again. Their first year of winemaking, neither Paul nor Carrie-Anne had a pump. He called Granger about a food-grade pump and was quoted $2,000. "Fuck that," said Carrie-Anne. Paul's thoughts exactly. He used a plastic hose to siphon wine from 32-gallon brut containers into 5-gallon Arrowhead plastic water bottles, then used a funnel to empty the 5-gallon containers into the barrel. There was a lot of splashing that year, but the wine came out pretty good. Good enough to encourage he and Sheila to make 2 barrels the next year. They were hooked. Their second year, Paul siphoned wine from a 50-gallon food-grain container originally used to transport Coke concentrate. This blue container with the white lid became a staple of Paul's winemaking for years, along with the Virginia Tech paddle. The container was higher than the brood, and halfway down, the siphon hose lost its suction. In winemaking, there's always something. He took his favorite bucket and dipped it into the container and poured new wine into the barrel. Year 3, they had moved to the Hidden Hills, and Mac loaned Paul a simple $100 electric pump that worked fine until it clogged with sediment, causing another midnight panic. By the 4th year, he figured it out. Their winemaking grew exponentially, like a curse from the sorcerer's apprentice, their lives taken over by bewitching grapevines. Each time Paul met Lum, he greeted his teacher with, "It's all your fault." Carrie-Anne became a junkie looking for her next grape fix. When she heard about an opportunity to purchase a ton of Pinot from Santa Barbara County after that movie Sideways came out, She and Steph rented a truck, drove up, and hauled it back. After they scored those grapes, she got a call from a cab grower in Napa with grapes, and Steph and Carrie Ann were on the road again. The wine they made was so-so, and they would have saved a lot of time, trouble, money just buying good cabs and Pinots. Paul's garage filled to the roof as the production side of his business progressed. He needed more customers, but had a full-time job and couldn't focus on selling. While he and Sheila cut back production, Carrie Ann made more and more. To solve her storage problem, she purchased a 40-foot refrigerated container and put it in her front yard, just like the crazy ladies. "There goes the neighborhood," I said when I saw that ugly steel box on her gorgeous property, although she hid most of it under the limbs of old oaks and framed it with stone retaining walls. You could hardly see it, and real estate values held steady. The next thing on her to-do list was building a tasting room, which brought her face-to-face with a predator as fierce as a cougar with sharper claws and teeth. County government. Life out here in the unincorporated county is good, and government pretty much leaves you alone, unlike coastal areas under the jurisdiction of the California Coastal Commissariat. Technically, Carrie Ann was allowed to have a container, though Paul kept teasing her only crazy ladies kept containers in their front yards. Of course, some of the containers and trailers in the backcountry were where some of Miguel's crew and other migrants lived. In exchange for housing, the worker helped out on the property, with details worked out between landowner and tenant. There was a general policy of don't ask, don't tell. Of course they were illegal. They came here for a better life and contributed to the community with their work and didn't bother anyone. They made the community better, like wine improved by blending. After that first year pressing grapes by hand in Paul listened to Carrie Ann and purchased his own ratchet press. He used a steel rod to spin the top around and round, lowering the gear onto wood blocks above a wood lid covering the grapes. The more he turned, the more pressure he applied, and wine flowed and trickled through the slats. Paul picked up Bluey and danced for joy at the ease of the basket press, and what used to take all day, they finished in 3 hours. Paul didn't learn until he was finished he used it all wrong. When he went over to Carrie Ann to assist her press with Steph and John, he was surprised to see Carrie Ann standing at the press in one place, moving the metal level arm back and forth, ka-chink, ka-chink, turning the gear in the ratchet press tighter and tighter, so a river of wine flowed instead of a dribble. "What about your tannins?" Carrie Ann asked Paul about his lightly pressed wine. He didn't like wine with an abundance of tannins, preferring wine that was easy to drink. There was nothing wrong with that batch of lightly pressed wine. It was mostly free run, winning him gold at the Del Mar Fair winemaking competition. But his yield was low. Lum accused him of wasting wine by not pressing properly, a sin. After Carrie Ann taught him how to use the ratchet press properly, he, admiring her mighty torque and little grunts, separated the free run from press wine, believing the free run was pure ambrosia, then blended the separate batches to Bluey's and Sheila's liking. Pressing started off easy, slow, ka-chink, 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 back and forth, with the gearhead slowly grinding down the pole, pressing against the wooden blocks. Pressing is a labor of physical love. Agile fingertips playing violin strings vibrato as the winemaker caresses juice from the grapes with 5 successive in, out, back and forth pushes, pausing as juice flows from the fruit, then 5 more thrusts, pause, then 5 more thrusts, rest. At the end, they pant and grunt as the press moves no more, then give up, their strength spent. Paul prided himself on pressing just right, with the perfect amount of tannins, while Merlot Mac, Carrie Ann, and Joe graduated to pneumatic bladder presses, which Paul said choked grapes dry. As Sheila hosed the empty macro bin of remnant grape skins onto the driveway, Bluey plotted to snatch them after they left. Paul showed her how to scoop skin-lace water and filter it through a strainer to keep harmful skins off the driveway, away from Bluey's reach. "That's the best idea you ever had," she said. For Paul, the best part of winemaking was fermentation and breaking the skin of the cap and tasting the warm, sweet lava. If winemaking eventually became routine, even monotonous, the magic was renewed each year with the first batch of wine, as exciting as the consummation of the wedding, as thrilling as a first kiss. And so it was, in the fall of 2008, when Paul punched down the cap and pressed the wine. The world's worries broadcast over the radio bounced off his ears. What was that about Bear Stearns? Lehman Brothers? Rising mortgage defaults? Credit default swaps? All that could wait, as he was absorbed, hypnotized, entranced by the elixir and songs of the vines. When Paul was 16 years old working at Chez Jacques, his colleagues were salty men twice his age. One night, Horst asked, "What is the difference between panic and terror?" I don't know," replied the Virgin. "Panic is the first time you can't come twice. Terror is the second time you can't come once." Horst's joke returned to Paul the morning he removed the sheet from the neutral bed to find his bride frigid. Fermentation had stopped. She wasn't done. He wasn't done. He had a ton of grapes tasting somewhere between Welch's grape juice and Manischewitz that had unexpectedly quit fermenting. This is winemaker's panic. He boiled water, measured dry yeast, added hot water to cool to make it the same temperature as his body, and rehydrated the yeast. 20 minutes later, he took a cup of juice from the stuck fermentation and added it to the rising yeast. Could he get the fermentation up and going? When nothing happened after his second attempt to restart it, he felt terror. While Paul fretted about stuck fermentations, in the corner offices of San Diego's enlightened companies, business leaders, including Gary Ridge, CEO of WD-40, Ken Blanchard, head of the Blanchard Companies, and other servant leaders, such as Marshall Goldsmith, saw signs of the approaching economic storm and asked themselves, how the hell can we sail through this with all our staff intact? On the other side of Hidden Hills, Joe the wino called an extraordinary weekend meeting of his company's board, overlooking a serene vineyard. The economic forecast was clear as a satellite photo of 5 Category 5 hurricanes simultaneously bearing down on all U.S. coasts. Their course of action was decisive and went beyond the periodic 10% cuts Joe had institutionalized to maintain a top-notch workforce, his version of pruning. The executives planned a preemptive first strike to reduce their workforce before the downturn hit, even though sales and profits were increasing and reached record highs that year. Joe had an uncanny instinct for market timing. By trimming excess now, the executives reasoned, their company would survive. They obeyed Machiavelli's logic that if painful cuts were necessary, they would cut deeply and decisively and wrap their arms around remaining staff to strengthen their morale. What concerned Joe more than the impending economic tempest was the possible election of a liberal president who would be an enemy to business and ruin the country.